Hello, welcome to Diamond Bay Radio. This is Lex Berman, and I'm recording in Arlington, Massachusetts. And my guest today on Diamond Bay Radio is EmadAys. He is calling in from Cairo, Egypt, and he is a member of the Science Fiction Association there, and he is the editor of a major book on Arab and Muslim science fiction. Welcome, Emad.
Pleasure to be here.
You've just had the call to prayer there. What's it like over in Cairo today?
It's very hot. It's a bit better than the past few days, but it is hot.
I think it would be best if we simply introduced your book.
Here it is in glorious color, Arab and Muslim Science Fiction Critical Essays, edited by Dr. Zambili, and my good self. Dr. Zambili is the founder and director of the Egyptian Society for Science Fiction, and the book was his brainchild. I'm the co-editor, co-author. I have 2 chapters in the book, and I did the translation work and most of the editing.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
I was working for the Egyptian Society for Science Fiction beginning 2016, translation work mainly. And Dr. Zambili found that it wasn't enough for me just to do book reviews of our publications, publish them in English. It needed something, a real game changer. And it came at the best time possible, 2018, me doing the same work over and over again, translation and book reviewing. It can get a bit stale. So he said we should do a book, and he wanted it to be first-person perspectives of actual science fiction writers in the Arab world. I was thinking more in line of something more academic, with studies done on the publishing science fiction in Arabic and Muslim countries. But the book ended up being a combination of both. And that's why we have a very interesting mix. We have, first of all, we have 45 chapters, 45 contributors. 13 of the articles are academic articles. 17 are interviews, and 15 are personal essays. And we cover 29 countries, 4 continents, and 14 of our contributors are women.
That's fantastic. I wonder if you could describe a little bit more about each contributor and their countries and their contexts and how they got involved in this as well.
Okay. First of all, Dr. Zambili gave me some names of Arabic authors, different Arabic countries, who he'd worked with previously in the publications for the Egyptian Society for Science Fiction. We have an anthology series called Shams al-Ghad, Son of Tomorrow. That was the first thing. Also, I worked with my friend Ahmed Salah al-Mahdi, and he brought in an illustrator. Dr. Zambili wanted to have the diagrams, pictures, illustrations in the book, so he brought in a young guy called Amir Zand, who's a very bright boy, very bright lad. He doesn't live in Cairo, sadly, but he contacted by Facebook and email. And I brought in some people I knew. I brought in Marcia Lynx Quayle, who's a blogger. She has a famous blog called Arabic Literature in English. I met her at the American University in Cairo when she launched her blog. She gave a talk there. I also brought in James E. Gunn, the late James E. Gunn, the head of the Gunn Center for Science Fiction. I knew him briefly by email when I was at the American University in Cairo. I contacted him, something to do with his books in the library. But I brought him in. And then Marcia brought in Rebecca Hankins, who's somebody who's appointed by President Obama himself. Big prestige. And then it just sort of cascaded. Another friend who helped a lot was Dr. Georg Matthias Detterman, a professor in Qatar, actually, Virginia University there. And he's interested in similar fields, astrobiology and Muslim science fiction. He also helped us with getting some authors, but mostly he gave us advice on how to publish the book. And also Marcia and Rebecca, they had tremendous experience with editing, so they helped form the book. They helped structure it and portion it out and how to present it to publishers. We tried, first of all, with a university publisher here in Egypt, in English. I won't say who. They ditched us, but in the process we learned a lot about how to present a book proposal, how to make it palatable, and how to polish it and everything. And the list of names just grew and grew and grew. Some of the really cool names we have some really big names. We have, like I said, James E. Gunn. We have Rebecca Hankins. She got a beneficiary of President Obama. We got Dr. Naif al-Mutawa, who's a Kuwaiti comic book creator, one of the few science fiction writers there, and he got a prize from President Obama because of his TV series The 99, which was all about tolerance, fighting against extremism. Rebecca Hankins, she was archivist appointed by President Obama. We have the first and top science fiction writer in the Emirates, a woman, Noura Noman. We have a famous Iraqi intellectual, Dr. Ibrahim al-Marashi. He's not originally a science fiction writer, he's a professor, but he did his PhD thesis on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the Bush administration used that thesis illegally to try to prove that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't. Yeah, we have two contributors from Iran, Dr. Zahra Janissary Landani. She's a professor of English and Comparative Literature, and she probably has one of the most substantive chapters in the book. And the Iranians typically are way ahead of us, both in science fiction and in writing about science fiction. And she wrote it in English, of course. And a funny coincidence, she'd originally written her chapter for a book contest, and I'd also applied to that same book contest, but the book got cancelled. They couldn't get enough contributors. So we ended up, two of our chapters ended up in the same book here. We also have an Iranian publisher and translator who's the top publisher of science fiction in Iran. And her brother is one of the top science fiction writers in Iran, Mr. Iraj Fazil Bakshishi. We have Coauthored from Tunisia. She studies and teaches science fiction, and she's written a lot about science fiction professionally. We have young authors. We have Muad Baid from Morocco as well. We have Dr. Faisal Ahmar from Algeria, who's a university professor and one of the pioneers of science fiction in Algeria. He had set up a SF group and an SF magazine. Sadly, it didn't last, but still, and he's a guy who has books written about him. He's that distinguished in the field of science fiction in Algeria. We have the only science fiction writer in the whole of Libya with us. We have, let's see, so I just have a terrible memory for names. We have a gender activist from Jordan, Fadi Zermout. He's with us. We took a very rounded approach. We didn't just focus on authors, translators, professors, and literary critics, and publishers. So you got this broad overview of the whole genre, the whole discipline. It's not just individual authors. And we have 4 Turkish contributors, one of whom is a publisher and translator. And the 2 of the Turkish contributors are women as well. And they're members of Bilkerim Kulübü, which is the top SF group in Turkey. And they told us also, then I asked a lot of organizational questions about how the discipline is set up, what groups, the nature of the membership, what their obligations are, the kind of literary awards they dish out, all of these things. We also have the top Uzbek author in the world, Mr. Hamid Ismailov, who's living in exile in England, and we have a Russian Muslim author, Mr. Shamil Idiatulin. He's a Tatar Muslim from Russia. We have Harun Siljak from Bosnia. He's currently living in Ireland. He's studying there. We have one Lebanese author. Wish we had more. From Australia. He's half Polish, half Lebanese, half Polish. We have an Indian author and professor, Sami Ahmad Khan, and we also have 2 Pakistani authors, Sadiq Saqib, who's a science fiction writer, and we have a professor as well who's an editor of science fiction, Muhammad Aurangzeb Ahmed. He's a professor of artificial intelligence in America, and he also he presides over Islam and science fiction online. And I've published interviews with him before, and he also edited the first volume of Muslim science fiction stories translated to English.
With such a broad variety and spread globally, I'm just wondering, are there identifiable themes or concerns that appear in the process of gathering all these information about these science fiction authors and their points of view?
Excellent question. The thing we discovered early on, two things. One was tremendous diversity, and at the same time, commonalities, common ground. We have African authors. We have Musa Wild Ibnu, Mauritanian author. We have Mame Diani from Senegal. We have two Nigerian authors. Mame Diani is a Senegalese American French, actually. He's a very diverse person. And he's a great guy. He's a SF and horror writer. Yeah, we did find these, first of all, diversity. As Egyptians, we thought that the science fiction produced by Muslims would be all pro-Islamic and all about role models and moral virtues and that kind of thing. We found huge diversity. You have countries that are very secular. Morocco, Tunisia, Syria, very secular. Egypt, Pakistan, Malaysia, very religious, and everybody else is in the middle. Algeria is in the middle. Central Asia is in the middle. No, of course, Saudi Arabia is very religious. But again, everybody has his own take on the religion, and they use literature in different ways. Some just take Islam as a cultural backdrop, and they talk about certain problems. Other people actually want to advocate, moral virtues and things like that. And it's all to do with individual countries and their histories. Iran, of course, it's an Islamic republic, but again, their understanding of Islam is very different. Can I tell you a Turkish joke, if you don't mind?
Of course. Fire away.
Yeah, a Turkish friend told me this when we were in England. He said, "We Ottomans, we Turks, we succeeded in making the Bosnians Muslims, but we failed in making the Arabs Muslims."
Of course.
Yeah, so
yes.
The Turks, to them, Islam means clean streets and law and order and rule by law and these kind of things. To us as Arabs, we think of prayer and fasting and beards and these kind of things. Iranians, religion is philosophy. They understand it in a philosophical way, in a spiritual way. So even in a country like Iran, Islamic Republic, again, they have a different arc. They write science fiction that's more humanist. They focus on the universality of the human spirit and morals, and they incorporate myths from pre-Islamic Iran into it very frequently. They write very interesting science fiction compared to us.
So that's why you said that the Iranians are way ahead, is the rich cultural context.
Oh yeah. Them and the Turks. They have much more access to European literature than we do.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about women authors. I think that we met through an article I wrote on Safia Kato,
Exactly.
who's an Algerian author, and she's the first science fiction author in Algeria.
I read your article with great interest, and I began to understand things myself I hadn't fully understood. One of the first science fiction writer in Kuwait in the 1980s was actually a woman, Tiba al-Ibrahim. First science fiction writer in the Emirates, Noura Noman. And of course, the very first science fiction novelist of all was Mary Shelley. The pattern that you noticed in the book, and we got this really from Dr. Coauthored. She'd done a huge survey of Arabic science fiction and how it began, is that the drive for independence, the Algeria, Tunisia, Lebanon, Syria, when they're getting close to independence, you begin to get science fiction being written, people trying to imagine a better future, create a better future. And that's when women become proactive. And Safia Kato, she was she was a political activist and a journalist. And your article explained I didn't know that about her. And so her journalism, sort of investigative journalism, and her science fiction were kind of the two sides of the same coin. She wanted to imagine a better future, a socialist future for her country after they finally got rid of the French occupation. Now, whether that's sustainable, that's another matter, sadly.
I imagine there's also reaction, right, among the sort of devout Muslim world, that there would be a reaction against some of the progressive forces that science fiction usually represents.
And no, amazingly enough, we never came across that in our book. Libya, for instance, Abdul Hakim al-Tawil, Libyan author, said one of the things that's resistance to science fiction in Libya comes from, interesting enough, machismo, They see science fiction as any kind of intellectual pursuit as being unmanly. Literally in Libya. I think it's in Saudi Arabia there's some problems like that. That's true. Ibrahim Abbas, a Saudi author, he got into trouble for a novel he did about a genie who falls in love with a woman, and he got accused of perpetuating paganism or something like that. That's true in Saudi Arabia, and I'd also wager it may be true in Yemen. Yemen has very peculiar problems. We have a Yemeni author, a great Yemeni author, Wajdi al-Adhan. He said that in Yemen, not only do you have the critics and the clergy to worry about, you also have the armed militias. Anything they don't like, they ban straight away. But generally speaking, in the Muslim world, Arab world, we don't have that problem. And a lot of the authors that write, some of them are very religious, conservative guys, but the way they present women in their writings is very positive, very proactive. You have women who are scientists or medical doctors. They might not be the hero, but they're not passive as well. And you can find women that engage in zap kapow action, literally. And Dr. Zambili has a novel called The Half-Humans, a space adventure novel. One of the characters is a female android, and she saves the hero several times. And she's very proactive and figures out how to the weak points of the enemies and hit them here, etc., 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 that kind of thing. To the point that the hero falls in love with her. And she's a robot.
That sounds like a great book.
Yeah, it is.
I wonder if we could shift a little bit to Egypt and your experience there. I mean, I don't know much about Egypt science fiction, but I've heard a little bit about some of the major authors like Tawfiq and how they appeared in these series of, I guess you would call them like pulp or fantastic, sort of ghost stories type things, and these appeared in great profusion in cheap editions in Egypt. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this background of Egypt culture and how this science fiction appeared and influenced the writers of today.
Excellent. Very happy that you mentioned that. Almost all of the Arabic authors we spoke to had read either Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq and Nabil Farouk. Nabil Farouk, he did the Future File series, as well as the Impossible Man, Spy novels. And Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq did the Paranormal series and Fantasia series. Fantasy, which is actually part science fiction as well. And everybody we talked to author in Morocco, he'd read it. We talked to Coauthored in Tunisia, she'd read it, and she wants to teach it at school. She actually wants to make it a curriculum. We talked to people in the Emirates, they'd read it. We talked to people in Yemen, they'd read it or heard of it. Jordan, several authors there actually knew Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, met him, and they'd all been inspired by his books. The pulp sci-fi saved science fiction in the Arab world, not just in Egypt. Egypt is the heart of the Arab world. It's the most populous Arab country, and it's the pioneer of modern Arab literature. The first Arabic novels were written in Egypt. Of course, Naguib Mahfouz, the Nobel Prize winner. Science fiction is more complicated. Science fiction didn't begin in Egypt, but most of the science fiction in the Arab world, the Eastern Arab world, is in Egypt. Most of the authors. The first person to specialize in science fiction was an Egyptian, Had Sharif. He's called the Dean of Arabic Science Fiction. He began writing in the 1970s. And he was the first person who was able to get sponsorship, you could say, found a patron for his science fiction. A famous Egyptian author, Yusuf Sharuni. Yeah, Yusuf Sharuni has a book on Arabic science fiction, actually, and I've used it in my studies. So Egypt science fiction began in the 50s during the space race between the Soviet Union and America, and that caused a big consternation in the Arab world. There was modernist Arabic poetry popping up, and people talking about science and industrial future. So you've got two people, Yusuf Izzeddin Isa and Tawfiq al-Hakim. Tawfiq al-Hakim, famous literary author and literary critic in Egypt and the Arab world. And they both did radio plays for science fiction, more so than writing stories. And that shows you that they were trying to reach a wide audience and get them to love science and see science as a driver for progress. In the 1960s, you got Dr. Mustafa Mahmoud, who's an Islamic thinker, And he wrote the first proper Arabic science fiction novels, very polished novels. He was a very skillful writer. He also wrote some plays as well. And it's a real shame that he stopped his fiction writing, moved into nonfiction after that, philosophy. Big, big shame. Very, and also quite, I don't want to say a radical writer, but he pushed the fold. He has a novel called Afyum, which means opium. He has a dystopian novel called Rajul Taht Sif, Man Under Zero. He has a novel about reincarnation, Khurub min al-Tabut, Out of the Coffin. And he was a conservative Islamic thinker, but he actually wrote quite radical stuff. And he has Al-Ankabut, the spider, also about reincarnation, about genetic memories. It's like watching Altered States. Quite a, it's like a detective novel about the search for identity, these kind of things. But 1970s, you got Nahad Sharif, and there were other established authors, established names who wrote a little science fiction. And then you get a long period in the 80s of aridity. The only people that saved the day, like I said, were Nabil Farouk and Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq in the 1990s with their pocketbook series. There's also Raouf Wasfi, to be fair. He also has a pocketbook series. And that created a whole new generation of readers. And those people, many of them grew up to become writers. They were inspired by pocketbooks. And a lot of them write action-adventure and fantasy stories, dark fantasy. Like Ahmad Salah al-Mani, he was inspired by that generation of writing, by those two pulp sci-fi authors. And important thing, in Egypt, it's a country that's very discouraging for reading. People have economic problems, people have bureaucratic problems, people have transportation problems, people have family problems. Reading is a kind of luxury, never mind writing. Pulp fiction saved the day, changed things. People stopped reading Mickey Mouse magazine. There used to be a Mickey. I used to read it when I was a kid. I'd look at the pictures, to be honest. They began reading the pulp sci-fi and action-adventure stories. And it cascaded. It created a whole new generation. But the real thing that set things, that released it all, was the Arab Spring. 2012, you get the Egyptian Society for Science Fiction being set up, and then a whole bunch of other groups. There's the Nahad Sharif Cultural Salon, there's the Abdul Qadir Husseini Institute for Science Fiction, if you could call it that. It's just they do a series of lectures on science fiction. And finally, the Egyptian Writers Union, which for the longest time completely ditched SF and belittled it. They have their own science fiction section now, and they've done conferences, and I've attended some. They had a conference on robotics. So the landscape changed and began with those two SF writers.
With those writers and around the Arab Spring, I wonder if I could ask you a couple more questions about Ahmad Tawfiq in particular. The first question is about his fantastic supernatural series where the character is a eccentric medical doctor, and it seems a lot to be autobiographical. That was the first question. And the second question is about his later novel, Utopia, which I think some people have actually associated with the Arab Spring. I wonder if you could comment on Tawfiq in those ways.
He was a tremendous individual. I didn't know him personally, sadly. I came a bit late to the game. But I'd watched interviews of him on television on matters of literary criticism. He was an expert on Agatha Christie. He was just a great guy. He was a really fun guy. And he was a medical doctor, and he had very bad health. He had heart problems. He died from a heart attack. And he had to take medication all the time. So you're right, that's a very autobiographical novel, his paranormal series. And it's finally been made into a Netflix series with an Egyptian actor and also a Lebanese actress. But I haven't read the paranormal series myself. The ones I've read are from his other series called Fantasia, Fantasy. You have a woman protagonist. She goes to this dreams machine, puts it on her head, attaches herself to electrodes, and she chooses some sort of fantasy scenario, and it creates a world for her. One I read, interestingly enough, is set in Iraq. And do you know who's in Iraq fighting against the Americans? You guess? Che Guevara. The Chinese get a sample of his DNA and clone him, and send him there to make life difficult for the Americans. And
Wait, so Shay's been cloned by the Chinese and sent to fight against the Americans in Iran.
Iraq, yeah.
Kind of far out.
Yeah, it's
Iraq. I mean,
but
this is...
but you completely buy into it.
This is the potential that Arabic science fiction has that other people don't understand. I really hope some of this stuff makes it into translation.
Me too. It's funny and touching and tragic all at the same time. And the woman, she's a proactive role. She saves his life a couple of times in the story, and he has moments of soul searching. The Iraqis don't like him. They see him as a foreigner, so we'll figure our own country by ourselves. And they're Islamic fundamentalists, of course. He's a progressive left-wing guy who fights, who's not interested in money, and he fights for the poor of the world. Now everybody's a religious fanatic or an ethnic nationalist or something like that. And he eventually feels that he's not contributing, that he can't make a difference, and he has to leave and go somewhere else. And it's a real shame, and it shows you that even though this was pulp sci-fi, you had proper characterization, you had character arcs, and people had their own volition. This wasn't short story writing. This is a proper, very compact novel. And he was very descriptive and picturesque, but again in a very smooth, compact way. Nabil Farouk, he's the proper pulp sci-fi guy. He's all action and cheap thrills galore and surprises, and plot twists, these kind of things. Ahmed Khalid was a proper novelist. He just did it in a simplified way to reach normal people. Now, concerning Utopia, and I actually heard this in an event, memorial event for him. He only wrote Utopia. It was inspired by one of his pulp sci-fi novellas, but he wrote that really to satisfy the critics, to get the critics off his back. They wanted him to do serious, full-length novels, and he made it depressing and bleak in the ending, just to satisfy the critics. He himself, like I said, was a very cheery, optimistic person.
But that book is very dystopic. It's a kind of a future scenario in which the rich live in compounds and everyone else is relegated to these just dismal ghettos. And it's kind of like the Hunger Games, only worse, because the rich people go on an adventure into the poor area, deliberately like on a safari, to kill someone and bring a trophy, a piece of their body back to show that they've been there. And the whole thing goes south and becomes a novel in which horror and identity are mixed up in a very very sophisticated way. It really says something about human nature.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, in a way, it's a beautiful book, although it's a horrifying and depressing book.
He deliberately made it depressing to get the critics off his back. And my friend Ahmed Salah Al-Madi, he grew up reading Ahmed Khalid, and he was very disappointed because of how graphic it was, because of the bleak ending. But when Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, he was trying to set a warning to people that if you don't deal with this gap between rich and poor, you're going to get a social explosion. There's no two ways about it. And I would add to that an extra element of Egyptianness on his part. In Egyptian literature and culture, we have the Hara. Hara is the neighborhood or the quarter. And Egypt, from like the 19th centuries, or 18th, 19th centuries, cities are kind of segregated. You have places like Garden City for foreigners when they were ruling Egypt, and then you have the Hara Sha'biyya, the very common place for the poor, and very Dickensian kind of reality. I think he was drawing on that as well as describing modern-day Egypt with compounds for the rich and these kind of areas. So if you read it as an Egyptian, you can...
I wonder
features.
I wonder if you have anything to say about the future of future prospects. Are you going to build upon this book, and have people had success in presenting new ideas and getting new publications out? What do we have going on that's exciting now?
We have projects for the future, either a second edition of our McFarland book, which right, which is still a bit early. But what we're more eager to do is to translate our short stories from our Shamsi Red series, our Son of Tomorrow series, and also to see if we can get contributors, short stories to be translated from our contributors, and do an anthology and publish it in English. That's that's Dr. Zambili's idea. That's a great idea. I endorse it. And we're sending out feelers also to some other publishers in other countries, but I can't get details right now.
Well, that's exciting. I hope that I wish you all the success in the world, and I hope that despite the connection issue we had between America and Cairo, that the recording comes out okay and more people can listen and reach out to you. I really hope that they start holding panel sessions on this topic at WorldCons and other places, and where people can absorb the information and enjoy what's going on, which is clearly just a whole realm of fantastic writing and ideas that you've gathered together in this great book.
Yeah. Here's a word of advice to publishers in the West. If you guys don't pick us up and fast, the East Asians are going to get to us first. It'll be too late. You know what I mean?
Yes, I mean that's the trend. That's the trend, right? Like with the WorldCon going on in Chengdu and the attention and the motivation going on among the publishers in Chinese, Japanese, and other languages in East Asia. It's really kind of like where the motivation is going right now. But I don't think that
there's India.
I mean, that being said, there's a lot of people who dump on Anglo-American science fiction dominating everything, and it's all got to be in English. And on the other hand, there's people like me who just say, well, I wish I could read Arabic, but I can't. So I really want to read your stuff, and I hope that there's a way for me to do that.
We have lots of friends in America, Canada, who are helping us tremendously. People who are university professors who work in translation, and they're trying to promote us with Western publishers. And the publishers are not interested. The only stuff they're interested in translating at the moment is dystopian literature coming from Egypt, because of Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, because of the Arab Spring. But I actually wrote an essay about this in a book with Rachel Fantastic. It was a book on translation in science fiction, really great book. It covers a whole range of countries in detail. And I explained in my tiny little essay, little contribution, that we have lots of subgenres. We have alien invasion, we have cyberpunk, we have robotics, we have first contact, we have colonization of new worlds, and we have our own distinctive subgenres like Sufi science fiction. And nobody in the West is interested. They just want dystopian. They've stuck to a certain set of names. Thank heavens there are other publishers. India is another country that's interested. They did recently the first book of its kind. They translated Afrofuturist stories into Bengali, and I participated. I have a story in that. They're very enthusiastic, open-minded people, and they speak English as well, so they can help us even in the English.
So I know you've published articles on these topics, and I think what I'm going to do is, when I post this podcast, I'm going to provide a list with links, because maybe part of the interview wasn't clear, but I want people to be able to see what's going on and have references to some of the names you mentioned and so on. So I think that this is a great start, and I look forward to having lots of conversations with you in the future.
Same here.
And I just thank you so much for your time. It's a great conversation.
The honor's all mine. Inshallah, God willing.